Military Seahawk Podcast.
Well, hello there, and welcome once again to the Military Seahawk Podcast. My name is James McNeil, and on behalf of Hawk Talk Radio, I'd like to say welcome. Today we have as our guest Jeff Farkas. I hope I'm not really butchering your name. You gave me the thumbs up. Jeff is not only a very good friend, he is a fellow student, and I will stop there and let him tell his own story. We got a few questions to go through, so when you were a kid, first question, when you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, when I grew up, I wanted to be a pilot. I think I was influenced by movies like Star Wars and such, and the other thing that I wanted was really to kind of branch out and see the world a little bit. And so when I went to enlist in the military, my first choice was the Air Force. And back in the late 80s, the first question they ask for you is, what's your vision? And my vision was way too bad, and so I had to start shopping around a little bit. So I looked at the Air Force, and they didn't want to offer me a specific job. And so I looked at the Marine Corps, and they were very similar. They award your job based upon your test scores. And so I talked to the Army, and they were like, you want a job? Well, here's a job for you.
Excellent.
So that really didn't change much as I grew older. I still wanted to be a pilot, and about halfway through my career, they changed the vision requirement to where it was correctable to 20/20. But what I didn't realize at the time was that it was changed to 20/50 correctable to 20/20. So I still didn't qualify. Yes. So when I enlisted in the Army, I told them I wanted a job to do with computers and drafting, and they said they've got a job for me. So they made me a 13 Echo cannon fire direction specialist.
Lovely.
Yes, it was all right. I was in the artillery. After I had picked my job, the recruiter was like, do you want to be airborne? And so I thought about it for about a half a second, and I was like, sure, I'll jump out of airplanes. And so off to Fort Sill I went to be qualified as a cannon fire direction specialist, and then on to Fort Benning for jump school. And then I was stationed at Fort Bragg.
And for those who are listening who aren't familiar with the terminology, jump school is, of course, airborne school. It's just our lovely way of saying it.
That's right. 3 weeks of torture, where you go run 4 miles every morning and then subject your body to all the aches and pains of being slammed into the ground as in a parachute. So I was pretty proud of myself at 18 years old, to be a parachutist, at Fort Bragg. And
I can understand that for sure. Well, you've actually answered the first few questions. You said you wanted to be a pilot. What particular type of aircraft, or did you have something in mind that you wanted to fly?
Well, I really wanted to fly jets, but it just wasn't an option. Not in the late 80s for a guy that didn't have 20/20 vision. They had all the pilots that they need, and so they made the cut off the vision requirement, and they still had all that they need. So, like I alluded to a little bit, as I progressed through my career in the military, eventually I came to the part where I was making enough money that I could afford to get my pilot's license on my own. Talk about that a little bit more later, I think.
Yes, I look forward to that part.
Yep. I've always wanted to be a pilot, and I enjoyed jumping out of planes. I mean, I figured if I couldn't fly one, I might as well jump out of one.
That is an interesting way of looking at it.
Absolutely. And then later on, I got tired of jumping out of them, and I realized that I could achieve my dream of being a pilot. But going back, when I was 17 years old, I was a Boy Scout and did some of those extracurricular activities. And my family has a history of military service. My dad was in the Air Force. My uncles were in the Navy. And the Army just happened to be my service of choice. And it brought me to North Carolina. And I loved North Carolina so much that I decided to stay even after I was out of the military. So my job, I wanted something to do with computers and drafting, and being a cannon fire direction specialist kind of touched the surface of that. So we worked on a computer, but it wasn't a computer like you might think of today. It had very specific functions. You know, it was designed to figure out a direction and an angle and a powder charge so that artillery round could go from where we were emplaced at to where it needed to go.
Exactly.
Yep.
I love how you're just progressing this along so perfectly. For those of you who have been listening for a while, whenever we have a guest, we send out questions for them to know that we're going to ask these questions. And he's just going through these, answering these before I have a chance to ask them. This very well could be the shortest interview ever. But before we get that far, I have to admit I am geeking out just a little bit. Because when I was a kid, one of the things I wanted to do was to learn how to fly. When I joined the Army, I actually had the ability to become a pilot. I had the eyes, I had the physical capabilities, and then something I don't share very often, but whenever I was going to put my packet in to go to flight school and warrant officer school, I messed up my knees. So then all of a sudden I didn't qualify anymore. So for someone who gets to fly, even though it was civilian, I kind of get to live vicariously through you, and that's an amazing feeling. So that's one of the reasons I reached out to you personally to say I'd like for you to be on the show, because you get to do what I would love to do.
Absolutely. And what young people don't understand is that there are paths to get them to where you and I wanted to be that I didn't know about when I was 17 and 18 years old. I didn't know that to become a pilot in the Air Force, you had to have a bachelor's degree. I thought I could just show up and say, hey, I wanted to be a pilot. But the Air Force has a couple of pipelines that they use to recruit their pilots. Their favorite one is, of course, the Air Force Academy. Those guys have a really good track on getting what they want in their career choices. Now, that doesn't mean that a student at UNCW doesn't have the opportunity to go be a pilot for the Air Force or the Army or the Marines. There are other venues that kind of can get you there also. One of the things that UNCW used to do years ago, they had a ROTC program, but it fell off. I guess there wasn't enough interest in it, so that program doesn't exist right now. But go ahead.
Yes, there is actually a plan to bring that program back. Bill Kaczynski has talked about it a few times. I don't know exactly how far that plan has gotten, but there is a plan to bring that program back, and he's really excited about doing it.
Yep. So an ROTC program is a great way to get into the service and help you to become an officer, which the officers get all the good jobs. Yes. But the other thing I didn't know about until about halfway through my career is you can come out of high school and talk to an Army recruiter and tell them you want to be a pilot, and there's a program for that, the high school to flight school program. Yep. And they're taking people off the streets, especially some with a little bit of aviation experience, and they put in a packet that goes before a board where they select a certain number of people to enter into this program, and they go through basic training, and then they go to the warrant officer candidate school, and afterwards they become helicopter pilots.
It's a little different than that. At least it was when I went through. I was in AIT, or advanced training, and I was learning to work on helicopters. Mm-hmm. When I joined the Army, I decided I wanted to work on helicopters. And there was someone who was in my class who was in this program, and it wasn't just straight from basic to warrant officer school. He actually had to go through and get his job and then do his job and show his competency there. And anytime up to that point, he said they can pull him out of that warrant officer school.
Yep. And that's where the bulk of the Army's pilots come from, is from guys that have been in service between 3 and 7 years that enter into the program. They show their experience in the Army. They put in a packet and they compete against their peers to become helicopter pilots. The smaller percentage are those that come in, straight out of high school.
Yes.
In fact, that's what I was trying to do. About halfway through my career, I put in my packet. I wanted to compete to become an Army warrant officer helicopter pilot. And again, I found the roadblock of your vision's not good enough. But at that point, I had done enough work that somebody cued me into the technical warrant officer program. So I became a 131 Alpha field artillery targeting technician.
Okay.
Those guys, the FA techs, they start off on Firefinder radars, which is a nice piece of electronic equipment that tracks and computes where incoming artillery comes from so that you can send that information to a firing unit and shoot back. So our specialty at first was counterfire.
Okay.
After a while, about 10 or 15 years of these field artillery guys doing just counterfire, the Army got smart and said, hey, these are some pretty smart guys. They understand this stuff. Let's expand their role. And so from counterfire, it expanded into targeting, which had the warrant officers kind of predicting where to put the radar so that they could anticipate where that enemy counterfire was coming from.
Gotcha.
They expanded that also to where targeting was more general. So when at the end of my career, it was bringing together all the tools that were at our disposal to achieve the common effect. And that tool could have been an artillery round, an Air Force jet dropping a bomb. It could have been a commander on the ground that goes and talks to somebody, or a platoon of infantry. Usually it was most effective if you were using all of the above and bringing them together with the right timing, with the right message, so that you could do what you wanted to do.
Now, I will say that most likely there are some people who are listening and saying we don't get the military jargon. I love hearing what you have to say. Most of it is kind of self-explanatory with counterfire. You're being shot at, you're returning fire.
Absolutely.
What did you like about your life or your job as a warrant officer?
Well, mainly I like the people, especially the airborne community, because it's a lot of volunteers. If you didn't want to be there, all you had to do was say, I don't want to jump out of airplanes anymore, and they would find you a different job. And so it was pretty much that simple. So everybody that I worked with was driven, type A personalities. They wanted to be the best that they possibly could be at the job they were doing.
Gotcha.
And sometimes it was tough to keep up with those guys.
When you're around type A personalities, sometimes it can be.
Absolutely.
Tell me something you didn't like about your job.
Oh, gosh. I tell you, I wasn't a fan of all the physical training. I mean, it sure keeps you in shape, but getting up at 5:30 or 4:30 in the morning to go run 4 or 6 miles really took a toll on me.
Yes, sir. That is one thing I don't miss after getting out of the Army is the physical training. I was in pretty good shape in the Army. I am a shape now. I am round. That is a shape. So, for me, I'm with you on the physical training. Like, why do we have to do this? I know why we have to do this, but I don't have to like it.
Well, it just shows another quality that you really learn in the military, and that's persistence and discipline. I mean, the discipline was good. You have to be able to, when you don't want to, get up and go do something that you don't want to do because you know it's what you're supposed to do. And that's really one of the biggest takeaways from my military career.
As I had mentioned earlier, Jeff and I are in one of the same classes, and the class is called Leadership and Organizational Change. This is a class I wish everyone had the option to take. But during that class, we had a video from General Schwarzkopf, and he said one of his rules was to do the right thing. And you just said it right there. Discipline is doing the right thing because you know it's the right thing to do, even when you really would rather do anything but.
Well, the hardest part is doing the right thing because you know it's the right thing to do and nobody's looking at you. There's nobody over your shoulder and you're out there doing what you're supposed to do anyways.
That, my brother, is integrity.
Yep.
What is the coolest thing you ever did in the military?
I've got a few things that I thought were pretty cool, but in 1994, I jumped. We had an airborne operation from Fort Bragg that flew into Dayton, Ohio, which is like 30 minutes from my hometown. And so I jumped into an air show. And what I didn't know at the time was there was a gentleman in the stands at the air show that saw that and thought, I want to be like that guy. I want to jump out of airplanes. That's what I want to do. So years later, I'm in Iraq in a fob and sitting behind a desk, punching keys on a computer. And the NCO that's next to me is telling me this story about why he wanted to join the military. And I find out that he was in the stands that day.
Wow.
And joined the Army. Now, the funny thing is that him and I had been stationed together prior to that in Alaska. We knew each other, but we didn't know we had that kind of connection.
It is definitely a small world.
It is.
That's going to most likely top the cool stories.
Yeah. Now, I was pretty proud of myself when I graduated Jumpmaster School, too. I mean, that's a school where you have 100 people start, and at the end, you're graduating 50, So a 50% attrition rate, and I graduated the first time through. There was a little bit of luck involved, but still, there's always a lot of luck because all it takes is one little injury or one little thing, and you're looking at coming back in to do it again. That's a summary of a lot of business opportunities and careers in general. You're at the right place at the right time, doing the right thing when nobody's looking, and an opportunity presents itself. And next thing you know, you're running a flight school. So that's my current story is I always wanted to be a pilot. And so when I was at the end of my military career, I was finally making enough money to be able to afford it. So I went and got my pilot's license. And I flew my family around. We would fly from Fayetteville down to Myrtle Beach or Fayetteville to Wilmington. We've always had a deep connection with Wilmington. And I just progressed and I got my instrument rating and I built hours. And right before I retired, I took the qualification to become a flight instructor. Well, I happened to own an airplane and I moved it with me to Wilmington. And so that airplane created the opportunity for me to do what I'm doing today.
We have talked before our classes for a few weeks, and I love hearing the story that you have about what you do. Again, for those who are not familiar, you mentioned hours. The amount of time that you spent flying and how qualified you are is measured in hours. We had a pilot at Fort Campbell. I worked with the pilots at Fort Campbell, and he had over 5,000 flight hours.
That's pretty
Exactly.
respectable. Yes.
And he had flown everything from the Cobra up to the Apache. And he is most likely retired by now. That's been a few years. But the idea of flight hours, it measures how much time you've put into flying and how well trained you are. The more flight hours you have, obviously, more often than not, the better pilot you are because you're more experienced. Am I close to that?
You're right. So it's not something that you can just kind of hop into and say, okay, I'm going to go work for the airlines. I mean, there's a long path to get there. But on the flip side of that, the airlines are hiring qualified pilots. It's a pilot's job market right now. So if you can progress through a private pilot rating in about 40 or so hours and then get instrument rated to fly solely reference to instruments in about another 40 hours, get qualified as a commercial pilot at about 250-ish hours, and then most people will flight instruct to get to 1,500. Now, it's not cheap. It requires some dedication. It requires you have to study. I mean, there is a ton of information to learn. But if you're qualified as a commercial pilot with the multi-engine rating and you have 1,500 hours, the airlines will hire you. And it's not easy starting off, but after 4 or 5 years, you're making pretty respectable money. And after 15 or 20 years, a lot of those guys are well-to-do.
Yes.
So that's what I do right now. I teach private pilots and instrument pilots. I don't really have much ambition to go off to the airlines because it's really kind of a young person's job. My goal is to be comfortable in Wilmington. This is my retirement destination.
Right. I can definitely understand that. And also, as a nice little plug, if there's anybody listening that would like to become a pilot, just reach out to Jeff, All-American Aviation Services. Is that what I see?
That's right. Our phone number is 297-8811. And you don't have to go all in. If you're just looking for an activity to do on the weekend to see the beach from a different area, you could call the number and ask for a discovery flight and just go take an hour flight. Go see the river, Fort Fisher, the beaches, and take some cool pictures and have a good experience.
I keep meaning to take one of those. One of these days I will.
Oh, it's a lot of fun.
Okay, the plug is over. Is there one habit or is there one mindset that you carried from the military to your life as a veteran?
Well, it's that discipline that we talked about earlier. It's getting up to do something that you don't want to do, even though nobody's looking at you to tell you to do it. I mean, I could miss class. I easily could skip class if I wanted to and still probably do pretty well, but I don't. I come to every class that I can, and if I have to miss a class, it better be for some extraordinary reason.
I noticed that last semester. You were there every class.
Oh, yeah.
Is there a habit that you were glad to drop after you left the military?
Not really so much a habit, but I'm grateful that I don't have somebody to tell me your time is up here, it's time to move on, and we're going to send you to someplace you don't want to go.
So you don't have, the moving is done.
Yeah. And, if I were to pick a habit, it's probably the language. Some of that active duty military language is, it's kind of shady. It's kind of, they cuss a lot, and it's really not necessary.
Well, I have been known to flavor my language a little bit from time to time, but there's also the understanding that, as you said, it's not really necessary.
Well, a lot of times it's just the boys, especially in some of the, like the infantry, artillery, even sometimes the engineers, where it's used to be just guys. Things are becoming way more integrated now, and so the language has toned itself down a little bit. But we get customers from Camp Lejeune that their language is atrocious. They don't know how to act in public, and it's not just the Marines, but the Army guys are just as bad. They don't know how to act in public at 19, 20 years old, and get themselves in trouble.
And unfortunately, no one's teaching them. Okay, this I'm going to put into two questions. What are you studying at UNCW, and how did you get here?
So UNCW was part of my retirement plan. I wanted either a job in aviation or a job that supported my aviation habits. And to go back to school was a relatively easy choice because the GI Bill is a wonderful benefit. Enlist in the military, do 3 or 4 years, get the GI Bill, have a college degree paid for with a living stipend on the top end of that. And it was a transition time for me anyways. And so I took advantage of the opportunity to go back to college and finish my bachelor's degree. So I'm studying business administration with the concentration in leadership and management. I thought it would fit well into my military experience. And so here I am, almost done.
Almost done.
Yes, it's hard. It still is hard because I know that I could make decent money just working at the airport. And I'm so close to finishing that I'm not going to give up. Driven to finish.
Driven to finish. That is one habit from the military. I can definitely appreciate that, and I understand where you're coming from. We're close to the same age. I never did get into flying as much as I wanted to, but I'm going to be graduating in May. I'm so close to it. And there's times during this journey getting to here that I wondered if I was going to make it. And I'm sure you have as well. Am I going to make it through this? Is this worth it? And I can tell everyone listening, regardless of your age, Jeff and I are no longer spring chickens, but we're making this happen. If we can make this happen, you can make this happen.
Well, this is what employers are looking for. They're looking for a person that's driven to succeed, even though there are obstacles in their way. And that's why a lot of these jobs are looking for a bachelor's degree. They don't care if you're good at calculus or statistics, because if they need you to be good at that, they can train you to be good at it. What they can't train you to do is to be driven and motivated and dedicated, loyal and persistent. That's what they're looking for in your bachelor's degree. So not finishing really just shows that you're willing to give up.
Exactly. You and I have both been through times where giving up was an option, but we didn't let it stay an option.
Absolutely not.
So, well, we've talked about you as a pilot. We talked about your military service from one veteran to another. Welcome home, brother.
Thank you, sir.
Where do you think you'll go from here? Once you graduate, what's next?
Well, that's a really tough one because, like I talked about earlier, if I wanted to, I'm a prime hire for the airlines. But I think my goal, I know my goal is to just live in Wilmington. So initially what I'll do is I'll start picking up contracts out of the Wilmington airport. Flying corporate people around to wherever they need to go for their business meetings. I think I'll stay on with the flight school because I'm pretty loyal and dedicated to the business that I helped start. Even though it's not I don't own all the business, but I am a pretty key player in there, and I would feel bad about leaving it. But there's you got to keep your options open, So maybe I'll apply to GE or Corning, or I might think about looking at other businesses in Wilmington, just so I can enjoy living close to the river, close to the beach, in one of the most beautiful towns in the state.
Wilmington is a very beautiful town, I have to say that much.
So it's a job in aviation or a job that supports my aviation habit.
I love that, a job that supports your aviation habit.
Yep.
It's not the worst habit you could have by far.
Well, it's expensive, but it's awesome to be able to hop in an airplane and be in Asheville in 3 hours.
Right past the traffic.
Absolutely. It takes me about 10 hours to drive out there. No, Asheville's a lot less than that. It's I think Asheville
would be about 6 hours.
Yeah, about 6, but I can be there in 3. I can get to Ohio in about 4, and it takes me a good 10 hours to get up there. I can be in Florida in about 4 hours, and that's in a small single-engine airplane.
And so, for anyone listening, if you want to tag along, he might be persuaded to put you in his luggage. I'm not sure. That was a joke.
Yeah.
But I do appreciate you coming on with us today, Jeff, on the Military Seahawk Podcast. Once again, we are brought to you by Hawk Talk. It has been a wonderful pleasure talking with you and learning about life as a warrant officer. Most people who are in the various branches of the military don't even realize that warrant officers exist, but they do.
Well, the great thing about being a warrant officer is you're in between the NCOs and the officers, and so you can kind of be outside of both of them. And the NCOs realize that Chief has been around for a while, and the officers realize that Chief gets stuff done for him. And so both sides tend to leave us alone to get in there and row and do our job and do what we know is right to do.
That is one of the reasons I had considered being a warrant officer. And there are times I wish I had actually followed through with it, hurt knee or not. But once again, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you for coming on the Military Seahawk Podcast, and thank you for listening. We have been brought to you today, once again, by Hawk Talk, and hope you have a fantastic day. Thanks for playing along.